Greetings! Welcome to Dungeons and GURPS. I am Enraged Eggplant, and in this video I will discuss something that might seem counterintuitive. If you have played GURPS or if you have heard about GURPS, you probably know that most GURPS books are very thoroughly researched, making them excellent resources even for non-GURPS games. For example, GURPS Fantasy is an excellent world-building book that can be used regardless of the system. And I could say the same about GURPS Space. But what about the reverse? What D&D books can be useful when running a D&D style GURPS game? I'm going to talk about D&D 3.0 and 3.5 books, as I am the most intimately familiar with them, but do not disregard other editions. Some older books are excellent resources. First, let's take a look at the core books. Player's Handbook doesn't really have anything useful. Everything presented there is strictly mechanical in nature and most of it already exists in GURPS. Monster manuals, all 5 of them, and other monster books such as Monsters of Faerun and Fiend Folio have a lot of material that can be converted to GURPS. They also have some lore pieces that can be adapted to be plot hooks. Personally, I love bestiaries. They really make your imagination run wild, and different fantastical creatures are something I'm looking for. However, they aren't really necessary for a GURPS game. Remember that I already have the first 2 monster manuals converted. Dungeon Master's Guide is, I feel, one of those books that not many GMs have actually read properly. I admit that I used to be one of such GMs. I thought, I'll manage to come up with something, I'll just use Dungeon Master's Guide for prestige classes and magic items. Only some time later, I decided to read it from start to finish, and I was surprised to see that it's actually a good book. It has a lot of GMing and world building advice, helpful tables and other useful tools that would have been handy back in the day. I think that the Campaigns chapter of GURPS Basic Set and the Powers in Action chapter of GURPS Powers suffer from the same problem. People often ignore them. If you're looking for GMing advice oriented more at D&D style fantasy games, then giving Dungeon Master's Guide a look is a good idea. Sure, GURPS Basic Set does something similar, but in a more generic way, but there are some bits that GURPS does not have. There's also a lot of information on adventure design and environments, probably even more than GURPS Dungeon Fantasy 2 Dungeons and GURPS Dungeon Fantasy 16 Wilderness Adventures have. I'm sure that you can easily expand the latter two with stuff from the Dungeon Master's Guide. And now let's go through the rest of the books. Arms and Equipment Guide won't be useful for you. Whatever it has, GURPS has got it covered, one way or another. The only interesting thing here is various exotic weapons, and I already have converted all of them to GURPS. I think I should make a video on that topic. Book of Challenges has pre-made encounters and traps that can be easily adapted to GURPS. It also has sidebars and small sections of GM advice that can be applied to GURPS, such as using anti-magic zones, familiars as scouts, and playing monsters that are smarter than you are. Book of Exalted Deeds and Book of Wild Darkness, despite being books about handling good and evil in your games, respectively, actually don't have much interesting in them. Most of the content is purely game mechanical in nature, and you won't need that in GURPS, unless you enjoy the process of doing the conversion. There are some interesting lore bits, but I am trying to disregard lore when talking about the usefulness of books in this video. Cityscape is an excellent book even if you are playing GURPS. It describes how to run an urban campaign, how to design cities, politics, organizations, urban encounters, events and hazards. Sure, GURPS has some of that in the basic set and GURPS City Stats and Boardroom and Curia, but Cityscape is a much more extensive volume. I highly recommend giving it a look if you're planning to run an urban fantasy game. Complete Adventure is mostly a mechanical supplement. Sure, it does have an organization building chapter at the end, but it's basically the same as GURPS Dungeon Fantasy 17 Guilds. Complete Arcane, however, has an interesting chapter on GMing a campaign focused on spellcasters and world building around magic. Other than that, it's just mechanics. Complete Champion not only has the usual mechanical bits, but also describes how to design organized religion in fantasy games. For example, it will tell you what the clergy of a deity of knowledge does, what the goals of a church of a deity of law is. It's pretty nice. Complete Divine adds some more notes on organized religion, but not much else. Complete Mage has some character creation advice that can be useful to GURPS players as well. It describes spellcaster archetypes, what kind of role they play in the party, and what kind of spell they should get. Complete Psionic is widely considered to be a very low quality supplement, and I have to agree with a common opinion, which is a shame because I really like psionics. Some lore bits are alright, but some of them make absolutely no sense. Even the mechanics here are very questionable, but that's not our problem. Complete Scoundrel doesn't really have much going for it. Neither does Complete Warrior, because GURPS martial arts exists. Defenders of the Faith was often forgotten by D&D players. After all, why use a 3.0 book when there's Complete Divine and Complete Champion for D&D 3.5? However, Defenders of the Faith has a lot of material that did not get updated in the aforementioned books, such as advice for playing clerics and paladins, more good stuff about creating churches and religions, and even guidelines for running a temple. Deities and Demigods is a very good world-building book. I have not read GURPS Religion for the 3rd edition, but probably discusses the same topics. Draconomicon is full of both interesting mechanics and lore, but there's nothing that can be used in GURPS right out of the box. You'll have to convert stuff. Dragon Magic is mostly a mechanical volume, but it does have an interesting chapter with world building and adventure design advice if you really want to focus on dragons. But GURPS Dragons had the same thing. Draw of the Underdark, Fiendish Codex 1 and 2, Races of the Dragon, Races of the Wild, Races of Stone and Races of Destiny are mostly lore books, let's ignore them. Dungeon Master's Guide 2 is another excellent book for GMs. Adventure design, campaign design, world building, different playstyles, how to deal with problem players, how to make NPCs. Again, almost everything in this book can be used in your GURPS games. This is definitely a good book. Dungeonscape is a book about dungeon design. Basically, it's the same as GURPS Dungeon Fantasy 2 Dungeons, but much more comprehensive. Another good one in my opinion. Elder Evils is basically a collection of adventure modules. They probably won't be useful to you as adapting a D&D module to GURPS is much more difficult than converting a monster or ability. Enemies and Allies is a collection of NPCs, more or less useless for GURPS games. Epic Level Handbook is mostly full of game mechanics and its jamming advice is not compatible with GURPS. Exemplars of Evil is a book about villains. Not only does it have some examples, but it has a nice chapter on designing villains, and can be used in GURPS as well. Expanded Psionics Handbook is completely unnecessary. It's a great D&D book, but not a good GURPS book. Frostburn, Stormwrack and Sandstorm are 3 environmental books. Despite being among my favorite D&D books, they are not useful in GURPS at all. Heroes of Battle is a book on warfare. While at first it seems like something of a minigame book, it actually has some decent advice on how to incorporate the PCs in warfare campaigns and how to design adventures around that. Heroes of Horror is a decent book, but GURPS Horror is even better. Libris Mortis is something like Draconomicon, but for the undead, not needed for GURPS games. Lords of Madness is another book that is mostly lore. I love this book, but it doesn't bring anything new to a GURPS game. Magic Item Compendium, Spell Compendium and Rules Compendium are just compilations of magic items, spells and rules, not really necessary for GURPS games. Magic of Incarnum introduces a new magic system. While I have a GURPS conversion of it, it's one of my oldest ones, and it's a mess that needs a rework. Manual of the Planes and Planner Handbook are fantastic D&D books, but useless for GURPS games. Unlike Defenders of the Faith, Masters of the Wild, Song and Silence, Sword and Fist and Tome and Blood are D&D 3.0 books that were updated almost entirely in Complete Adventurer, Arcane, Divine and Warrior. Miniatures Handbook should be ignored, even though it's an underrated D&D book in my opinion. Player's Handbook 2 has some interesting character building advice, but other than that, not much else to say. Savage Species has some campaign building advice for games where the characters are monsters. Stronghold Builder's Guidebook contains everything you need to know about castles and strongholds. It actually might be useful for GURPS players, even though numbers will require some adjustments. Tome of Battle, Tome of Magic and Unearthed Arcana introduce new subsystems and variant rules. It's all mechanics, so it's not useful for GURPS games. And that's it. As you could see, I omitted setting-specific supplements and adventure modules. I think I should also give an honorable mention to World Builder's Guidebook, an AD&D world-building supplement that is extremely good. I used it a lot when designing my own setting. Other than that, I should also say that Dragon Magazine often has very interesting articles, even in the old issues, that can be easily used in GURPS as well. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.